All right, everyone, let's do this. I'm Drew McManus, the author of Adaptistration, and this is my podcast, Chop Talk, where I invite captivating guests to talk about engaging topics connected to the orchestra business. Today, we have a trio of captivating guests, so today's podcast will be a little longer than normal. We want to make sure we hear from everyone, and they've got so much good stuff to say. We definitely want to give them the time. But let's go around and make introductions. First up is Ann Guzzo. Ann is an internationally performed composer and the founder of the Wyoming Festival of Contemporary Music at the Grand Teton National Park. Passionate about new music, Guzzo performs regularly and teaches composition and theory at the University of Wyoming. Hello, Ann.
Hi, nice to be here.
Next up, we have Daniel Hagee. Daniel is currently the music director of the Wichita Symphony and the Binghamton Philharmonic and is the principal guest conductor of the Tulsa Symphony Orchestra. Hagee previously served as the music director of the former Syracuse Symphony Orchestra and makes numerous guest appearances with orchestras and music festivals across the country. Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Drew. Great to be here.
Thank you for being here. And our third guest is Holly Mulcahy. After hearing Scheherazade at an early age, Holly fell in love with the violin and knew it would be her future. She currently serves as the concertmaster of the Wichita Symphony Orchestra and Chattanooga Symphony and Opera and balances her orchestral duties with numerous concerto performances around the country. Holly works with Ann as the artistic director of the Wyoming Festival of Contemporary Music and also founded Arts Capacity, a charitable 501c3 which focuses on bringing live chamber music, art, artists, and composers to prisons. Hello, Holly.
Hello.
And in full disclosure mode, I am going to let everyone know that Holly is my wife, but she's not here, obviously, because she's my wife and I have no spousal connection with Ann and Daniel whatsoever. Everyone is here to talk about BIPOC and women composers as a topic. Right out of the gate, we need to determine and define exactly what BIPOC is. Ann, do you want to walk us through that?
Sure. Black, Indigenous, People of Color is what it stands for. And it's the latest terminology for adding diversity to your program or shorthand.
Terrific. Is there any particular reason that when we're looking at this, even with the title of BIPOC and women, we have the definition of what BIPOC is, why are women really separate from that definition?
That's an excellent question. Women have a very, very low rate of performance as composers and also as conductors. And so I'm sure you've covered this before on topics, or if you haven't, there's a very small amount of women performed in the major symphonies today. I think it's around 3%, and we're talking even with other living composers, it's still 3%.
An entire single digit. Well, we are going to dive into more about what that's all about. But first, to kind of do as a launching board into this, we want to talk about the Great Plains Composition Workshop, which is really why we have the three of you here today. Because the three of you came up with this idea and put this workshop into motion at the Wichita Symphony Orchestra. And if I'm not mistaken, today's August 22nd. And this the actual workshop was something that happened last week or the week before that?
Last week.
Last week. Okay, terrific. How does that connect to BIPOC and women composers?
One of the things that I agreed to do for this festival was be the guest composer, but I wanted to make sure that we always had or invited half women and as many people of color, BIPOC folks as we could, because I just feel like at this point in time, it's irresponsible to do anything other than that.
Daniel, Holly, you're the people at Wichita Symphony, so obviously you're going to be the connection as to making this actually happen and put institutional resources behind it. So taking from that idea that Ann was talking about, how did it become a thing?
Well, I'll speak up about that. I think that it's been a normal default for just too long for people to just kind of say, oh, well, we'll bring in these composers, and they kind of have a general mindset just through tradition kind of through laziness of just seeing certain names and kind of just defaulting to them without using any extra effort. And so I think if we truly believe in the mission of having equality and diversity in the arts, we sometimes have to make a conscious decision to try to make that happen. And the more often we can make it happen, the more people get used to seeing it. And so this was an opportunity for us when we had this workshop. Why don't we invite people in? Of course, highly qualified people who are very deserving, but also can be part of the BIPOC and women composers part of it. So I think it was a conscious effort, but it was so successful. I'm just so happy that we did it this way. But I think we all have to be mindful of purposely doing this sometimes, because it's not just going to happen on its own.
Well, and Holly, I'm assuming because you know and work with Anne, and obviously you know and work with Daniel, are you the connective tissue from this idea to get it into Wichita?
I think I would be that, because I've known Anne for 4 or 5 years and have partnered with her with the Wyoming New Music Festival. And this philosophy that Anne has, it's been something she's been exercising and championing for 5 years. So when we had this opportunity to present an online composers workshop, it seemed like an obvious fit to bring Anne in, because it's something we've already worked together on, but it's a philosophy that I know that Daniel has been championing as well. And so I thought that this is going to be a great team, this is going to be a win-win, and I think we did a great job this past week of exercising that.
Terrific. And I'm sure folks doing the math in their head realize this transpired while most groups are still in COVID-driven shutdowns. Did that have any kind of influence on the decision to do the workshop, or was the workshop in motion beforehand, or did they kind of evolve together? You know, Daniel, how's all that work?
Well, you know, a lot of us were trying to really turn on our creative juices. What are we going to do during this time? You know, when we're only able to really interact with each other through virtual reality, in a sense, right? We want to find ways to connect, and how can we do that with music? And because this workshop that Anne and Holly have collaborated on together over the years has happened in the summer anyway, it seemed like, well, the timing is there. And if there was an art form one could do in a virtual way, where you didn't really require other ensemble players or other people to get together, composition just seemed like a no-brainer. And so it seems like these things all just sort of came together in a very beautiful way. We had the extra time and energy to put into it. And as Holly pointed out, she and Anne have worked together on this, so there was a nice chemistry there. It was just a matter of connecting it to the Wichita Symphony. And as Holly mentioned, I've been very much in favor of doing projects like this. And so it just seemed to be perfect. We also have a staff and a CEO at Wichita Symphony who is very supportive. So all of the pieces really came together beautifully. And, you know, even at the end of the workshop, I was thinking, boy, this whole thing is just fraught with possible, you know, landmines where it could have not gone so successfully. But we had all the right people in the room, and we all believed in a common purpose. And the attitude of the leaders, Anne and Holly, were just so positive and nurturing for these composers. And the composers, in turn, were that way to each other and themselves. And it was just really beautiful. So, and we thought that could really happen. But, you know, it's one thing to have a vision that it can happen, and it's another thing for it to happen. So I think it was born out of several things, and it just came together in a very beautiful way.
I think the next step of that is, since this happened and it transpired during the pandemic, just like live performance, this is not something that lends itself by nature to a remote platform. What did you guys do sitting down after you came up with the idea of, hey, we have this thing, it's going to be really cool, but now how do you actually do it? What's the process involved? Anne, what? You know, you're the one, since looking at it from the composition perspective, how do you get people to actually come in and get something meaningful out of the experience?
Yeah, it was definitely a risk. And I think that the vision of Daniel and Holly and the Wichita Symphony was just really creative. And that matters to me as a composer. So I think that the way that we had success, especially in the BIPOC way and women, is that we advertise the festival for incoming composers in the usual places. Um, American Composers Forum, the Composers site, and I can send resources for the list later.
That'd be great.
But we also advertised in lots of spaces where I knew there were women composers and people of color. So there's several groups online, and if you not only did we advertise, but we made sure that our advertisement was open and welcoming. So if you ask people, okay, women, men, and any gender, right? Then you're opening it up to a space for people who don't feel like they fit on the gender continuum. And if we say people of color especially encouraged to apply, women especially encouraged to apply, that's the first level of sending out that welcome mat that says we really do want you. It's a new festival. We don't have any history, so we didn't have anything to work against. I know there's a lot of festivals that have a history of performing with only white male composers for years and years and years. And that sets you up for some problems to begin with. So that would be my first thing that I said. Now you guys can add about, you gals and guys and folks can add about the next level.
Holly?
Yeah, like what Anne said was the welcoming inclusion. We really want you. It was really interesting looking at the applicants who applied. It came across very inclusive and a very good representation. We had international representation, like Anne mentioned, women, and just a great number of applicants. And a lot of most of the applicants were extremely talented, and just a little bit, I was like, wow, we really pulled in a high caliber. So it was really an impressive grouping of people. It was very hard to pick the final composers that we ended up with because the caliber was just so high. And I think that speaks a lot to women and their acceptance in BIPOC, and just the skill level, that you should never assume that it's just going to be white male skill is going to be here and everybody below that. And this just proved it. I mean, I knew this, but just sharing this at a recital and just feeling really good about hearing the comments back from the audience that they really enjoyed each piece, I think it speaks volumes.
And you hit on an important word that I think is connected to this, which is recital, because we're still talking about process, kind of how it's set up, how you started to bring people in. Daniel is the person at the organ at Wichita, at least, who's going to be the artistic figurehead of, this is something I put my stamp on and we're going to do. A composition workshop would assume that there's going to be something to play at the end, but the orchestra is not in session. What did you guys do?
Well, we talked about this a few times during the workshop, and when we spoke to the public also. Of course, being in separate homes where the performers would be kind of makes sense with COVID going on. But it also really gives an opportunity for a composer, and of course Anne can speak to this much better than I can, but it gives a composer a chance to really show their skill in writing for one instrument. And that's not so easy, as we all know. There are places you can hide when you write for a large ensemble. You can write some interesting runs here, but you can have some other instrument that is competing with it. There are a few places you can go here or there, and not everything's exposed like it is for a solo instrument. So that really made sense to have the composers write something, and then we give it off to performers. And we had 4 musicians from the Wichita Symphony. Holly was one of them.
Oh.
And each of those performers would perform 2, and in one case, one performer played 3 of the pieces. So we had 9 composers altogether. I believe we had 29 applicants. And I just want to say one thing about the selection process. We're talking about having an interest towards making it very inclusive and diversified. But I have to say, I didn't really have any information on the composers when I was looking at their resume. I didn't really think about that very much. I actually made it a point to just look at their score and listen to the music. And I was so heartened to find out later that even my very top picks aligned with a kind of diverse and inclusive method of bringing these composers in. So I think that's what's really great. I was really looking at the quality of their composing and not thinking as much about that. Of course, in the final analysis, we wanted to make sure we had that balance that we were looking for. But I thought it's already there. That's what I thought was really great about this particular thing.
Yeah, it really was. That was a nice, not really a surprise, but because we had advertised in so many awesome different places, but the music really did stand for itself, like Daniel said, and we did put that as like, what would we want to represent? You know, what would we want to share with our musicians and get that nurturing ground going.
But those are two topics I really want to jump into a lot more detail than that. But before we do, there is one more technical thing that I think, from what I understand about the workshop, was at least a little unique in that it was very much geared more towards seeing how the sausage is made. Where it wasn't just, here's this new composition, a new music thing that we're doing, and all the patron base or all the audience in really experiences is that final product. That wasn't the case here, was it? No. And you look like you're, I got something on this.
Sure. Well, it was actually, I think, Holly's idea, but she said we need to invite anybody in who wants to see, and we'll name it either a backstage pass or an auditor's pass. So even if you didn't get into the festival for very little money, you could buy this pass and see every aspect. And one of the most valuable and beautiful things was the sessions with each performer, which I think I'll let Holly talk about.
This is what Anne does in Wyoming when we do our Wyoming Fest, is she will bring in a performer to just showcase what an instrument can do. Like, we had our clarinet player play some just awesome glisses, and our flute player did some flutter tongues. So just sharing these ideas just basically informs the composer what you can do with that. And 9 times out of 10, the composers writing for the flute wrote for flutter tongue, and the ones writing for clarinet had glissandos and just some of the tricks. And it was very interesting for the auditors to watch this. And I think some of the auditors will be reapplying and hopefully will be with us when we do this again. But like you said, it pulls the curtain back. You get to see this process of how a composer is introduced to a concept, how they're introduced to an instrument, and how they are kind of invited to work with a musician to create the best product. It's kind of a team effort in that way.
And I'll add in that we had sessions on working relationships with symphonic world too. So Daniel gave a great session that I'm assigning to future composers to watch about what to do and what not to do if you want to make nice with a conductor.
And actually that is, I couldn't have asked you to write a better segue to the next question with that, which is, yes, this backstage pass and auditor's pass was in place for people during the actual time it was happening. But is the symphony making this content available in any kind of free or paid archive sense?
No. This was Daniel's session was recorded for, I think, the composers, and the recital was recorded for archival use for the composers. But basically, if you missed it, you'll have to tune into the next one, I think.
Okay.
I think we wanted.
I was just going to say that's just kind of like the live music experience. You know, you're there in the moment, and that makes it special.
We also wanted to create an atmosphere where everyone felt so comfortable with just saying something, because when you're in a situation for the first time, you're afraid, oh, am I going to say a dumb thing, or should I try this? And you're afraid to be exposed a little bit. But we had a very nurturing, warm group of people, and we thought that if they saw the recording little sign up in the corner of their screen all the time, it would inhibit them just enough that it couldn't really take wings. So I think it was good to just say, this is happening in the moment. When it's over, we move on to the next thing, and it can evolve as it does, but just not recorded.
There we go. And then before we pop out of this, are there plans right now to not just maybe do something next year as an annual event, or turning this into something that's more of a few instances throughout a year type of event?
I think we're looking at doing this again. It was a big success. The comments from the audience that I've gotten have been just, everybody loved it. And so much so that they didn't realize how valuable it would have been to have the auditing pass, and that they didn't quite understand how the music was made. Now they're curious. And I love that point of curiosity, because that's just, our door is always open, but you know, having somebody walk in through that door and discover for themselves how music is made, why it makes you feel this way, and just building relationships with musicians and conductors and the whole process, I think is just really a beautiful thing. So we'll do it.
Well, where we want to head, oh, I'm sorry, Daniel.
No, I was just going to say, I think so many times when people, you know, maybe come to a concert hall or something like that, and they hear a piece of music, maybe a new piece, they think that that piece was just, it just sort of happened somehow. It's just there and it's presented, and they don't, hardly anyone takes the time or the energy to work backwards, like, well, how, wait, where did it go, and who made the connection? What was their inspiration for the piece, and why did they do this? I mean, when I study scores, I'm always asking myself about the composer's choices. I said, okay, the composer had a choice here to do this or this, and they went this way. And that's what's endlessly fascinating for me, and for people to get in on something like the workshop from the beginning and to observe things as they transpire, I think would be really fascinating for them.
I'm sure everyone's going to look forward to see what you guys come up with and when you're going to come up with something next as well. But you know, I'm now extremely anxious to jump into a connected topic with all of this, which, Daniel, you touched on this when you were talking about actually going through the applicants that had applied for the workshop, which is along the lines of normalizing this type of diversity. You know, right now, especially when I mean like right now, August 22nd, right now, on social media in particular, there are a couple of very high profile confrontation going on between some people in the business. There have been some articles in the New York Times as of late that, you know, that really challenge concepts of diversity, and people are still very polarized on this issue. And there's always, not always, there has always, I think is a better way to say this, been this stigma that goes with diversity, that it is somehow of a different level of quality than musicians or artistic organizations would apply to everything else they do to begin with. You know, is that something you guys had to actually encounter, or was it a conscious decision, parts of discussion? I mean, it all sounds very fluid, but you know, behind the scenes is a different story.
Right. So I think if we're talking about behind the scenes, there is some conscious effort made towards trying to make something as diverse and inclusive as possible, like this workshop. And I think, when I'm programming, I think about that also. But the goal in the end is to really make it seem, as you had mentioned, normal. So if we can normalize things where people don't even notice how we got to a certain point where it is a diverse offering of composers, BIPOC and women composers, so that people don't think, oh, I know we're here, but I saw how we got there. They consciously did this. Yes, we are consciously doing that. We're using still very high level criteria for people to be able to be performed with the orchestra or ensemble of any kind. But it's just important that we just keep doing that so that people become familiar with it. Because when people become familiar with something, they don't always ask the question, how did we get there? And that's what I think is important. Mm-hmm. Yes, behind the scenes, we think about it. But when we present it, it has to be done in such a way that it's normal.
That immediately brings to mind, from a historical perspective, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, way back in the day, in the beginning of the last century, when they were still a young organization, used to routinely perform new music several times throughout the season. The same piece several times throughout the season, to normalize it into repertoire. And this sounds very similar to that sort of idea. And this is something that I think, if I understand correctly, you've worked a lot on throughout your career, and it's an important topic. I think it's what you and Holly have put together when you set up the festival in Laramie, what sorts of ideas, concerns, or goals did you have trying to transfer it to something like this workshop?
I think the we didn't. I feel like we didn't have much of a hurdle to move it to this format. The worst hurdle was technology, but with solos, which I always actually assign first in my composition teaching because I think it's really good, rigorous work for you. But I feel like it was not much of a hurdle because if you know how to get applicants who are diverse, then you will have diverse people on your concerts. It's that simple. If you get a good pool, and that I think is one of the main places that people really fail, is they say, well, we didn't have any people of color apply. Well, of course not, because you've never spoken to any people of color. I'm going to tell a little story about the Lindy Hop community. I sometimes do Lindy Hop, which is this wonderful 1930s Harlem dance style. And it was invented by African Americans, of course, and it's primarily white these days. And I was on a Lindy Hop board, and they were saying, why are there no black people? It's a beautiful black art form. And someone answered, and they said, because you're not friends with black people. And we like to do this. This is fun. So if you have friends who are people of color, you invite them to do it. And I think that's one of the issues that we've always been dealing with, and Holly's been good at, and so has Daniel, is you have to know people. And the way you know people is you become friends with them. And you can do this virtually these days. I mean, my state is 94% white, so it's not like I'm drawing from a great population here. But if you get out there and you know people, then they become a natural part of your community, and it's easier. So I think that first step is really important, is inviting people in and making sure you know the places in which to invite them.
Absolutely love that. Holly, any thoughts?
Well, I think asking and listening too. And this goes back to one of my Zoom recitals. I had Kenji Bunch on, and he was talking about his in-school performance he did with a group of musicians, where group of musicians, like an orchestra that goes to a school and performs for like elementary school kids. And he was subbing in with some friends, and one of the kids, when they asked for questions, one of the kids says, can you play something from Hamilton? And the leader of this group said, no, we don't do that. That's not something we ever would do. And they talked about it in the car ride home as if it was like, how dare they ask for Hamilton? We are classical musicians. And it kind of irritated Kenji, rightfully so. He's like, you know, when you do outreach, you're reaching out, but hopefully somebody's reaching back in, and you have this conversation. So if somebody's saying we would like to have Hamilton, you kind of need to say, okay, I hear what you're wanting. I will offer this back, and meet in the middle, basically, is what he said, to get that conversation going. And I think that, yes, invite audiences in, invite relationships, but also listen and be open to really listening. I think that's where a lot of times musicians are the worst at listening, I must just say that.
Kenji has a really great little Hamilton piece now, doesn't he?
He does. He just posted another one. It's not shareable, unfortunately, but check out his Facebook page from last week. It's great.
If his first one is, be sure to include that in our resource links, which folks will find below. I do remember watching that video too, and it is very profound, especially the way he just delivers it, and with such just that sincere, heartfelt tone of really that opportunity missed, and moving forward. And it also, I think, helps distinguish between. There are plenty of groups that are moving in directions to try to improve diversity, but it is still something that the field as a whole stumbles with, and where programs that are put together are looked at more like a diversity checkbox. Okay, we've done this, we can apply for the grant now. And if we don't do that, then we can't apply for the grant, as opposed to actually starting to build a level of trust. But I think, Holly, what you were talking about is that trust actually goes in both directions. Yeah. The artists have to trust what the audience is going to tell them is not just what they think, and it's our job to tell them it's right or wrong, but it's something more than that.
Definitely. And this is something that when I first started working with Wichita Symphony, actually one of the big reasons is because Daniel has that philosophy very much in his DNA of just, listening and sharing the same way that I think about that.
I would second that right away. I really like how Holly thinks about how the music really needs to be relatable. When I first got out of school, I was a little bit, I have to say I've evolved a little bit, because I used to think this music is universal. So if you don't get it, then you need to work harder, and pretty quickly I realized, you know what? If they're listening and they're giving it a chance and they don't think it's as universal as you do, then you need to listen a little bit more to what they're saying. And it really was kind of like my eyes opened up a little bit. The other thing was, Drew, you mentioned that the Boston Symphony would repeat these pieces to increase familiarity with the work so that it could become part of the repertoire. And I also would think, as a young conductor, I thought, well, if I program this really crazy piece that it isn't relatable, no, it's not really. But if people give it a second chance or a third chance or a fourth chance, they'll get it eventually. And then at another time, the veil just kind of fell away. And I thought, if people said, I really had an unpleasant experience with that, I think I'll repeat it. No, probably not what's going to happen. So you somehow, I think whatever you can do, you can find the music, we have to use our instincts, and we have to be listening to the audience to see what is going to work well. They don't have to love everything they hear, but they have to have their interest piqued in some way that gets them engaged. And sometimes I've spoken with people who said, I didn't care for that very much, but there was something about it. It was very interesting. And I think, okay, good. I mean, I don't like every piece of art I've looked at, but sometimes I'll say, but that is really interesting. And I'll want to go back and look at it again. Music, we're not so fortunate because it happens in time. And so you actually have to perform it again for people to hear. So with that in mind, you really have to give it, number one, a great performance. And you also have to choose music that is going to resonate in some way the first time. Jerry Schwartz is actually one who talked to me about that. I said, you've had success with presenting music from the 20th century. And I said, what's the idea behind that success? And he goes, you have to perform music that people will gravitate towards, that they will like when they hear it the first time, no matter how unfamiliar it is. And so I think it is something just to keep in mind. People are probably not going to have chances to listen to something 5, 6, 7 times before they go, oh, okay, I'm starting to get it. That's just not, it's not a very efficient way of thinking how to program.
So what you're saying in this case is when you say it's not you, it's me, it's not just a platitude. It's sincere.
Yeah, it takes a little bit because, I mean, we come out of school thinking, well, I know this and I know this. And I think if they just knew it, then they would have the same feeling as I do. And I think it can happen sometimes. I mean, I can think of when I was a kid, I would just listen to pop music and I would buy like a recording of something that had my favorite song on it. And then I heard all these other songs that never made it to the radio. And I thought, actually, I like those better. They were unfamiliar to me, but as I listened to them more, so I do believe that we can obviously learn more with repeated listenings. But we also have to remember that the live experience of performing something is really special, and we have to make the most of that moment. We can't just say, well, they'll get it later, because that later may not come, and we have to see how valuable this time is, that we're doing it right now. We have to relate in every way we can. If words spoken that connect the people in the audience to the music help, then that should be used, or breaking down maybe a few themes or how it's constructed, or if the composer is there, that's really great because people see that a real human being wrote this music and they're right here. That all adds to the psychological positivity of how a piece is going to be received.
One thing that I think that Daniel does really well is if a audience genuinely likes a piece by a composer, there's a really good chance that same another work by that same composer will end up on coming up seasons, because my impression of how he programs is he wants people to, or invites people to get to know the composer, get to know their works. And I think that's a really audience-friendly thing to do, because it acknowledges that, one, the audience liked the piece, and two, here's another piece to offer so that you can get to know a different work but the same composer. And I just think that's a really generous way to program a season.
I want to just go on just on something that Holly said earlier in her first statement, and that was about the trust that one has to get. Because if someone in the audience says, "Uh-oh, new music, I'm not really that into new music," but then you play something and they go, "Oh, that was really nice." You have now exercised a muscle in their mind for saying, "I didn't think I would like it. That was a name I didn't recognize, but when I heard it, I liked it." So that the next time they see a name on the program they don't recognize, that muscle has woken up a little bit, and they're going to say, "But I'm going to give it a chance." And then, "Hey, I liked that one too." Pretty soon that muscle gets pretty strong, and now they're looking for it. Now they want to know, who's the new composer? I want to hear the music that's being written today, because I've been having these really interesting and invigorating experiences. So we want to wake that up in people, that sense of adventure and wanting to know, curiosity.
I think, I forget who mentioned it. Somebody said something about DNA, just about the culture of DNA being in new music. And I think that overlaps a great deal with what we're talking about with starting to normalize this process of diversity. But, I think one of you has a scenario where the DNA isn't just figurative, but it's actually literal, correct?
Yeah, I wanted to, in knowing about this podcast we were going to have, I was talking with my sister, and it dawned on both of us really that I could mention that our grandfather on my mother's side, Boyd Eagle is his name, and it was Piatote when he went into the military. He was raised on the Colville Confederated Tribes Nation, on the reservation there. Nez Perce, full-blood Nez Perce, Native American, and I'm 1/4. And he was a composer. That wasn't his job. He went into the military when he was about 19. And he was born in 1902, so you can see where the history is there. I mean, a very interesting part of American history. And he played as a musician in one of those bands. I don't know a lot about it because I wasn't able to discuss this a lot with him before he passed. But I do have some compositions left behind that I've looked at, and I've even arranged. I remember I arranged one of his pieces called Caprice for my sister's wedding. And we did relate to each other with music. And it's interesting because the reason why I think it might be interesting to talk about is because the lineage on my father's side were white, Anglo-Saxon, German. They were farmers, noble profession in its own right also. But I think the presupposition would be that they would be the ones who would have the advantage, being in America and being, kind of the pioneering spirit. They could have easily gone into that area of composition, but no, it was Native American. In truth, there isn't really a way that it's supposed to be or anything, but I think it's just what people expect. People wouldn't expect it to be this way. And that's something I think we have to keep in mind, is that people who are indigenous or black, or people of color, women composers, it's all around us. We just simply have to discover it and foster it.
Well, yeah, I think we're at a good point where we can start to kind of wind things down. This has been a really good discussion. And there's maybe some things I'm hoping listeners and readers in particular will be able to walk away with from this, is normalization, which we've talked about several times. And for me, process really does mean everything. It's not just here is our goal and we want to reach that. You will fall down in numerous places, and there are dozens of bear traps you can wander into throughout all of that. And it does seem very much like the field as a whole in this country is beginning to not just pay more attention to it, but realizing that waiting for this to happen organically, waiting for it to happen on its own or naturally, isn't really going to do it anymore. Normal got us to where we are now. So we're going to have to start doing something different to be able to, actually reach the point where I think, Daniel, we're talking about having that approach toward looking at the composers coming in and not really distinguishing diversity, but of course that still was at the core of what was going on. And once that just becomes second nature to everyone, I'm hoping that will be something we all get to see in our lifetimes.
Well, yeah, I just want to say, I think, you know, when I mentioned earlier, I think people will default to an easy or a more traditional way because it's easier. It's lazy. We just default to say, oh, well, let's put this on here. And why? Because sometimes there are only 2 or 3 works on a program. It's pretty easy to fill up those gaps with just kind of going to the same old grab bag as before, without really thinking about, well, who else is out there? And I think it takes a little bit more effort, a little bit more conscious activity to do it. And so if we can get to that point, like you said, we just normalize that so that it's something that we don't default to the old way, but we default to the new way, which is we're going to have diversity and inclusion on our programs just by nature.
And Holly, final thoughts?
Well, I think that's only fair because we look around our society, there's a lot to represent, a lot of voices to speak. And kind of going back to when I first wanted to be a composer when I was a kid, I was told they're women composers, they're not as strong. I wanted to be a film composer specifically. There were no film composers who were female. And so that was information I took in as, well, I guess I won't try. You know, I guess that's not in my future. And taking that little bit, along with what I've heard in the last 5 years from patrons, there's no such thing good as, there's no good music from a living composer. All the good music out there is from dead composers. So I'm just, like, between those 2 laws, I think that we need to, like, reanalyze where we are. We've got a lot of different voices speaking in this country, in this world, a lot of fantastic things to say musically, and I think that just listening and opening it up, it proves itself, and we just proved it. We prove it again and again that it doesn't matter who's writing, there's a lot to say.
And I'll just say that we have a lot to listen to, and I feel like in some ways we've been robbed over the years. We have so much to listen to. Just the other day I was listening to a couple of Florence Price symphonies, and those just weren't in circulation when I was in orchestras when I was younger, and I feel so sad that I never got to play those parts. And I really hope that this does become normalized, because I think we deserve to hear all the people.
Well, for folks watching this, considering, especially if they're at another organization and if they are decision makers, if there's one really quick piece of advice each of you can leave with them to try to start to put something like this in place on their end, what would it be? And we'll go in reverse. We'll start with Anne.
I think I would say from my perspective, composers are hungry to work. And if you make invitations for composers, especially diverse composers and women composers, we will flock to you.
I think that organizations need to realize they are the curators of our art, and art is a reflection of society, today's society. This is our time, and having composers from our time put into artistic vehicles to express is what we should do as organizations. It's really nice to have museum pieces like Mozart and Beethoven. Those are fantastic composers, but they're reflecting on different times. And I think that we need to be very, very supportive of our times and our artists, because they're speaking to us, for us, and with us.
Hashtag museum pieces. I like it.
You can delete it.
Daniel?
Well, I think right now we have just a great gift in the amount of technology that we have to be able to research certain things. So I think sometimes people feel like there's a stumbling block, like, well, how am I going to know about these people? How am I going to figure this out? And they just kind of end up not really doing anything. And I think what you do is use all the resources you have. I mean, you have a lot of colleagues out there. Go out and talk to them. There are all these databases out there. You can go research those. There's tons of recordings you can get a hold of. You can actually contact composers. It's not that difficult to do. And it just takes some time and some effort. You can do it. I agree wholeheartedly with what Anne and Holly have said. Look at our society. Look how we should be actually reflecting it. Get to know your own community and know them as friends, as was mentioned earlier. Don't just say, well, we're going to do this for you, and we've ticked that box, and now we move on to the next thing. Because it's not something that's going to be long lasting. You really have to become friends for a while and really try to understand what's going to resonate with them. And then you try to put these things really side by side with other works that you would be maybe normally programming, And so that it's not all kind of stuck on one program or this program, and then you call attention to it just for that sake. You blend everything together so that it becomes more normalized in its context. But really, don't be afraid to get on YouTube and Spotify and check out these databases, because it's all there and it's readily available, and it's never been easier than now.
Well, and speaking of contacting colleagues, are the three of you open to anyone who's watching this saying, well, I'm listening to this, I still don't have a lot of other people or places that I can go to, but I just watched these three people talk about this thing. Can they actually reach out to you, or no?
They can reach out to me. I get messages a lot at people saying, I need an octet for tuba by women, and I'm like, okay, let me hook you up. I've got like 5 Facebook friends right now who are just hungry for this, and so I'll just shoot them off. And I love introducing composers to people when they give me a specific what they want, personality, writing style. I love playing matchmaker.
And
yeah, absolutely. I'm an academic, and I'm also a composer, and I feel like I'm not a musicologist, I should put that out there, but I can connect you to a good musicologist if you want the more historical aspects, and if you want living composers, happy to talk to you.
And Daniel, you'll get the last word.
Yeah, of course. I would be available to receive whatever someone would want to offer. I'm used to being reached out to for many things, oftentimes for playing a piece, a concerto with a soloist or something like that. I think a lot of conductors are used to it from composers and from guest artists and things like that. And oftentimes I really just have such a long list of things that I'm already obligated to, or I've already made plans for, so I have to kind of keep it on a separate list. But by all means, yes, we want to keep this as an open dialogue between the people out there who might be watching this or thinking about where do I begin, to me and to our other guests.
And there we go. So everyone watching that wants to move and has an interest in doing more BIPOC and women composer works, we have 3 new points of contact, 3 new friends that you haven't met and ain't been able to actually reach out to yet. So speaking of the 3 friends here today, I want to thank all of you very much for taking your time out on a Saturday afternoon to join us and chat about this topic. Moving forward, I'm hoping we'll be able to actually come back maybe in a year or so and actually revisit phase 2 of this, that fingers crossed we'll be out of the, the pandemic environment that we're in right now, and see where we can go with this. So thank you all again very much for your time.
Thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Drew.